session 6 of our EDAD 707 Education, Policy, and Politics. This video lecture is going to focus on the state impact on local education policy. State education policymakers in the 21st century are caught between a strong federal policy development operation and a required local policy implementation function. This presentation will explore the policy and political clout of the states. Chief state school officers arrived on the scene between 1830 and 1850. They've been around for a while. The first state board of education was started in Massachusetts in 1837, and the first secretary was Horace Mann, seen as the father of public education in our country. Small state education agencies served as inspectors and enforcement officers. It took until the 20th century for the agencies to add real education expertise and to provide those services to local agencies. Federal pressures forced them to become more professional, and in fact, ESEA contained funding for state agencies to improve their services to the states. The state boards have traditionally been the weakest link in the state policy chain because they did not have staff, and only half of them appointed the chief state school officer. In many states, and including Kentucky up until Kara, the chief state school officer was elected publicly. State boards do not make policy, but they have no staff to implement, and they are strongly influenced by their chiefs and governors in the development of policy. In fact, some experts question the value of state boards and see them simply as a place for political posturing. The first big change in state-level policy engagement was actually a court case, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, in 1954, when school districts were ordered to desegregate. Depending on their stance on desegregation, states became involved in policy development and implementation to either support or oppose it. Desegregation was followed by the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965, which required states to be involved in the deployment of federal aid to schools. ESEA was in turn followed by a series of lawsuits by local governments in numerous states to equalize the level of local education funding. The Rose decision in Kentucky was one of the first of these lawsuits that successfully forced the state to increase funding and support for public schools. In many cases, their states were forced as a result of court order to increase their financial commitments to local education funding. As a result, the states now finance in total 50% of the funds for all local education budgets combined. In the 1980s, a nation at risk and business concerns sparked more interest in school reform. State-led efforts began to reform schools, and LEAs began mostly in southern states like North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Arkansas, and Mississippi, where governors recruited business support for education reform to ultimately improve their state economies. Governor Lamar Hunt of North Carolina put education reform on the agenda of the National Governors Association in 1986, which was immediately followed by George H.W. Bush's Summit of Governors to discuss education reform. State action on education policy culminated with the election of two governors as successive presidents, Clinton and Bush the Younger, and the federal policies of Goals 2000 and then No Child Left Behind. Education emerged as an additional general purpose of state government. The public and business concerns with education forced governors to become more involved in education. Education under gubernatorial leadership over the last 20 years has become a general government policy issue. Governors must now balance the needs of local education budgets with other state government needs. In Florida, for example, the education program was centralized at the state level with the State Board of Education appointed by the governor. This has given governors policy clout to implement changes. Governor Jeb Bush used his political capital to push vouchers, non-race-based college scholarships, and assign grades to public schools. But many parts of his vision were undone by subsequent governors. In Ohio in the 1990s, courts forced the governor to give more funding to local schools. Ohio Governor George Voinovich forced the state board to hire a new state superintendent of his choosing. Ohio's governors have subsequently had to balance funding with the demand for accountability. In Wisconsin, education policy battles are fought as part of the state budget. Recently, Governor Walker cut back on state contributions to public employees, including teacher retirement funds, something that is a familiar ring in Kentucky. The recent Common Core standards and Obama's race to the top gave governors more clout and interest in education policy. President Obama's race to the top furthered the push of the states to the role of policy implementers, and then began under Clinton and Bush. In fact, the federal government now funds over 40% of state education agency budgets, thus giving a strong incentive for states to implement federal policy. States manage federal funds for school accountability and standards. They also develop the local regulations and instruments for assessments. States must manage the growing racial and economic diversity in their constituencies. But there is some evidence that depending on the political or educational environment in each state, the states have taken more or less advantage of federal funding and power to gain control of education policy from their local agencies. For example, Indiana has centralized education policy implementation at the state level, while Nebraska has left all of it localized. Policy levers vary from state to state, for most of the financial clout is the big policy stake. But state legislatures also make charter school licensing possible, control teacher certification, and often take over failing school districts. State policy power is also fragmented between the governors and their chief state school officers, state boards of education, and their legislatures. And not to be ignored are state agency bureaucracies, where the work on policy implementation can hasten or slow reform. Since the 1980s, governors have increasingly inserted themselves into the making of state education policy. By the beginning of the century, every candidate for governor in the country made education reform one of their top priorities. However, once they are in office, governors must wrangle with state agencies, boards, and legislatures for control of ed policy. In only 12 states do governors pick the state school boards. In about another dozen, the boards have the chief state school officers are elected. While some governors try to eliminate chief state school officers, Florida succeeded for a while. Minnesota and Wisconsin have no state school boards at all. The control of state education policy and federal policy implementation are high stakes politics in state capitals. When President Obama signed the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, in 2015, the opportunity for SEAs to control policy implementation began to grow to the point where the balance of federal-state policy control is changing again. Through ESSA, the feds gave the states more flexibility and fewer accountability requirements. SEA authority varies from state to state, but most scholars maintain that state agencies hold 5 essential roles. Number 1, they articulate the state's educational vision and goals. Number 2, they select and implement the state's standards and assessments. Number 3, they design and implement the state's accountability system. Number 4, they administer, implement, and oversee state and federal funding and other programs. And finally, number 5, they communicate about critical education issues with stakeholders across the state. These roles for the state education bureaucracies require expertise and resources that are frequently not available. Therefore, many states have turned to private providers for the implementation on the local level. In addition to SEAs, governors must also contend with their legislators. This often makes it difficult for governors from different political parties to enact immediate and substantive change in policy. Interestingly, each state's politics and who gets credit for the reforms influence how willingly states take federal funds and are willing to do the job of implementing federal policy. New non-traditional actors such as the Gates Foundation, the Broad, and the Walton Foundations, as well as nationally based special interest groups, are challenging gubernatorial control for policy at the state level. Nevertheless, the biggest change in state education policy making has been the tremendous growth in state education power over local governments, management of federal programs, equalization funding, civil rights, teaching and learning standards, the Common Core, and now ESSA. They have all given new powers to the states over the locals, and in some instances more clout than the federal policymakers in education.